Today we are talking about the birth of consciousness, and we're going to see that it's not that a creator God created conscious beings, and it's not even just purely about evolutionary survival, even though that's what it sort of began as. But really what consciousness is our key to evolving into God. But as we'll see, it's sort of a double-edged sword, because this development of individual awareness is actually what pulls us away from our connection to the source to begin with, but is ultimately what will bring us back to the source, but on a higher level. So this goes along with the Hegelian idea that, the idea generates the natural world in order to fully develop itself, that the absolute needs to generate the world in order to realize its potential. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at in depth how consciousness relates to the one becoming many and then the many becoming one, because as we know, the one yearns to become many and the many yearns to become one. So we're going to look at that sort of dialectic and how it relates to consciousness. And we've been talking a lot about Julian Jaynes's theory and the bicameral mind, and we'll see how it relates to that as well, because once again we're going to see that it's that left hemisphere ego consciousness that ultimately, in the beginning, not ultimately, but in the beginning, pulls us away from our right hemisphere connection to the source, but we're going to want to bring it back in an integrated way. Anyway, I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself here, but that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's going to be really good, and we're going to be reading excerpts from The Holographic Soul by Mike Hockney, which is an excellent read, and as I said, we're taking a look at some excerpts from that work as we explore this, and I highly recommend that book. If you'd like to read it for yourself, I will put a link in the description of this video. It's really great. By the way, guys, on April 1st, which is April Fool's Day, we are having a Drunk Bible Reading Easter edition. It's going to be very good. Make sure you are there. Mark your calendars. Remember, it's the perfect day to celebrate Easter, April Fool's Day. So make sure you're there. You better be there, or I'm going to be very angry with you. So let's begin. Consciousness arose precisely because of the inverse Fourier transform. We could not be conscious without it. And so now remember, the inverse Fourier transform is about transforming frequency information into space-time information. So it's about localizing information. And consciousness is a wholly mathematical phenomenon. It arose from the switch from a dominant non-local mode of mind to a dominant local mode. Once we had this local mode, we could clearly distinguish ourselves from each other. Prior to that, we were so interconnected that we could not easily act as individuals, just as ants and bees can't. So here's this idea that consciousness is associated with the left hemisphere of the brain and associated with inverse Fourier transforms and localization of information and space-time representations. So, to put this more concisely, essentially, prior to consciousness, we were much more connected to the source. We were much more connected to the non-local domain. What consciousness allows us to do is really carve out our individuality. It's what allows us to act as separate, distinct individuals. In the source domain, everything is interconnected, and individuality is a lot less defined. So the thing is that consciousness is what pulls us away from unity, but also allows us to develop and evolve as individuals, so that when we do eventually return to unity, we will do so in a fully actualized way. So consciousness does pull us away and out of unity. We fall from unity. But acting as individuals in the holos, this allows us to learn, grow, and actualize. Therefore, when we do return to unity, we will be that much more developed. And this is, again, very close to the Hegelian idea that the idea generates nature, and that the absolute, through the development of nature, fully actualizes itself. So in Hegelian sort of terms, God requires nature to become God, or to evolve, or to fully actualize its potential. So here we have the idea that first we are all connected through the source, but we aren't fully actualized. We're all unconscious. Then as we develop consciousness, and the left hemisphere becomes dominant, we fall away from our connection to the source. And so, for example, we can see that today in sort of the paradigm of atheistic scientific materialism. Scientific atheistic materialism is the epitome of that left hemispheric dominance and falling away from the right hemispheric source. Atheistic materialists are all about localization. They're all about what they can sense, see, touch, hear, smell, sensory experiments, the scientific method, observation. It's all about what you see is what you get. What exists is what can be experimented upon. And so that left hemisphere individual consciousness becomes dominant, and we have lost our connection from the right hemisphere unconscious, the connected domain. But the idea is that we're also growing, evolving, and learning through our individuality and through self-awareness. So we don't want to destroy our ego, we don't want to destroy our self-awareness, and we don't want to destroy our I to be sort of reabsorbed back into the source. And this is kind of very similar to what Buddhists teach with their concept of nirvana. They want to eliminate desire, eliminate the ego, eliminate the I to be absorbed into nirvana. But that's not what Hyperions want to do. We develop this consciousness and ego for a reason, and that is to evolve as individuals. So we don't want to destroy that, but what we want to do is, now that we have attained ego consciousness and ego awareness, we want to bring back our connection to the source so that we can re-enter unity, but at a higher conscious level. So we were originally unconsciously connected. We want to now become consciously connected, which entails our actualization and reaching higher levels of awareness. Do you see the very important difference? It's not about destroying and going backwards. It's about continuing to build and reintegrating at a higher, more actualized level. Very important, very, very important difference. And you can also sort of imagine this, sort of a metaphor between a computer code and a video game. Imagine there just being the code. Well, the code is all interconnected. But when it generates the video game world, well, it can generate various avatars. And then imagine the code sort of experiencing the world that it generated through its various avatars. Well, now individuality can be greatly experienced through this generated world. And likewise, we as the monadic collective generate the domain of space-time, the holos, and through the domain of space-time and the holos, we can experience individuality. So the one, particularizes itself, the absolute unity, particularizes itself through a multiplicity of monads, who then connect to avatars that experience individuality in the local domain of space and time. And this is why it's very important for our triadic perspective. Always keep our triadic perspective in mind. Avatar consciousness, ego consciousness is sort of the consciousness that the vast majority of humanity has. But we work on developing the other two components, monadic awareness and then absolute awareness. So we want to be conscious of ourselves as avatars, as eyes in the space-time holos, as localized entities. Then we want to understand that we are non-local eternal minds, and then we also want to understand from the absolute perspective that we form one interconnected system. And by understanding these three perspectives, we are going beyond self-awareness. This is why Hyperions are the next evolutionary step. Those who are truly able to rationally integrate, not just metaphorically, not just picture thinking, not just Vorstellung, but rationally integrate these three perspectives. We are going higher. We are able to develop higher modes of consciousness, higher modes of awareness, integrate the hemispheres of the brain, integrate that consciousness, and reach a level where we're connected to the source and interconnected and forming that system, but still maintaining our individual consciousness as well. So once we had this local mode, we could clearly distinguish ourselves from each other. Prior to that, we were so interconnected that we could not easily act as individuals. We tended to act in terms of the monadic collective. That is machine-like, or ants or bees in their colonies. When people are hypnotized, they are docile and lacking personality and individuality. They become an extension of the dominant hypnotist's mind. In the bicameral period, everyone was like this, all waiting to be directed by the voices of the gods. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about via bicameralism, check out the video that's just prior to this one. I believe it's called The Dawn of Religion, How It All Began, where we discuss bicameralism. But essentially what's happening when a person is being hypnotized. So, when a person is being hypnotized and you're put in a suggestive state, what's happening is that you are lessening your left brain filtering and executive function, and you're opening up access to your right brain unconscious. So humanity is dominated by the left brain consciousness. And so this acts as a filtering system, this acts as a command center, etc. So when you're being hypnotized, it's kind of like also think of a computer, it's like a firewall. So when someone is being hypnotized and put in a suggestive state, that left brain function lessens and relaxes, and you're giving the hypnotist access to your right brain unconscious. And then they can embed suggestions and commands into your right brain. They're basically, since you are lessening your left brain control, you are giving them, the left brain is the one that sort of directs and controls. When we're talking about ego consciousness and the I, right? That's what I mean. So the self-aware aspect of you, the I, the selector function. Essentially, when that relaxes and you're put into a suggestive state, you are giving control over to the hypnotist and access to your right brain unconscious, where they can then embed commands or suggestions. As people started to become conscious, by the way, I also want to, notice how nefarious this is. When you're put into a trance-like state, I also want to notice how, just nefarious how advertisement sort of works like this. When you're watching television, you're put in this sort of trance-like state. And then guess what? You're bombarded by advertisements. Buy this, buy this, buy this. Anyway, just an interesting observation that a lot of things in this world take advantage of, sort of unconscious communication. So as people started to become conscious, separate rather than interconnected, they simultaneously started to become selfish, aggressive, and violent, keen to dominate others. This is a very, very important point. And this is why it can seem like consciousness is a fall from grace, or the exiting of the Garden of Eden. Because when consciousness arises and individuality arises, it brings a lot of strife. But that's just a necessary hurdle to overcome. It doesn't mean it's inherently a bad thing, but it's like a child that's learning to ride a bike. They're new to it, they don't really get it, and they're going to crash and fall and hurt themselves over and over again. And it can seem like a terrible thing. But once they figure it out, well, then riding a bike is extremely helpful. So that's why when individuals first start becoming individuals and conscious, selfishness, war, bloodshed starts to break out. Hatred of the other, racism, sexism, all this stuff stems from not understanding that we are all interconnected. So when we lose the understanding that we're all interconnected and become individuals, on one point, it's being an individual is a fantastic thing. Individuality is extremely important. But when we are so disconnected, that's when all this hatred appears and all this selfishness appears. Why should I care about you? I'm just going to attack you and take from you what is yours, and it shall be mine. I'm going to dominate you, plunder you. You seem different than me, so I will attack you and try to eliminate you. And this is what happens when we lose the understanding of the absolute perspective. Remember, that's why we need to have the absolute perspective that we all exist in an interconnected system. So that ultimately, from that perspective, to harm you is to harm myself. And that's why we should not harm each other. Because the hand should not attack the foot. We all are part of the body. And so we shouldn't be divided against each other. But that's what happens when individuality and consciousness first develops, because we don't have the understanding that we are part of a body, that we are part of a neural network. So I did a video called Is the Universe a Neural Network? And we talked about how a neural network is composed of different nodes or different neurons. And you have all these different nodes and neurons working together sort of within the network to produce results. And they reorganize themselves and restructure themselves to create better results. Well, when consciousness first arises, all the nodes and all the neurons, speaking metaphorically, and if we're talking about monadically, not metaphorically at all, but very accurately, if we're talking about monads as nodes and neurons, when consciousness first develops, the monadic neurons, the monadic nodes, don't realize that they're part of a network, so they act as individually and without regard to the entire structure. And if you act individually and without regard to the entire structure, you're going to have a really shitty network. And guess what? That's why we have a really shitty world. Because the world is a neural network. Just like the universe is a neural network. We have neural networks within neural networks. And so just like, since the world is a neural network, a monadic neural network, but the individual monads are just stuck in avatar perspective, and they don't realize that they are part of a network. They're all acting out for their own individual self-interests. or even the self-interest of the particular nation, you're going to have a really shitty network. It's only when the neurons and the nodes realize that they're individuals and can act individually, but also realize they're part of a network and work together as a structured system to create a more optimal network. Only then will you have a high-functioning optimal world, a high-functioning optimal network. And so that's the whole idea of the Hyperion New World Order and building New Terra. Our conception of building New Terra is simply this. It's about getting all the nodes to realize that we operate in a network and to structure the world according to a cooperative network where we are both individual nodes, but also realize we're part of a network. And that's another way to easily understand the Hyperion model. The monadic part, the monadic perspective, is the perspective that we're all monadic nodes. All individual monadic nodes. What's the absolute perspective? That we exist within one network. So the neural network is a really great way for understanding the Hyperion perspectives. And that's what reality is, one absolute network composed of monadic nodes that link to avatars. And the problem is that humanity only has the avatar perspective. They don't realize that they are monadic nodes, and they don't realize that they exist in a network. So that's what we must do so that we can build a better world. Again, our world is so shitty because it's a shitty network, because, you know, this is why we have wealth, vast wealth inequality, and the 1% rule over everyone else. And this is why, you know, we have horrible religious systems that are causing war. This is why we have sexism, racism. This is why we have world hunger. All these problems are the result of a suboptimal, aka shitty, network. And the reason why it is a suboptimal, shitty network is because the nodes don't realize they exist within a network and are acting individually rather than collectively. And we want to be individuals and a collective at the same time. It's about the dual perspective. We don't want to give up one or the other. We want to be individuals that work in an interconnected system. And again, this is sort of the difference between a lot of New Age, mysticism, and things like this. We have the network model, where we are nodes of one network. A lot of New Age systems, it's just sort of just one sort of blob where everything is dissolved. There's no nodes. It's just sort of a dissolving. Anyway, let's continue here. So as people started to become conscious, separate rather than interconnected, they simultaneously started to become selfish, aggressive, and violent, keen to dominate others. Thus we entered the age of war, of male rule, in which the most psychopathic men rose to the top. The world has been ruled by male psychopaths ever since. Psychopathy is a kind of ultra-individuation where a person has no sense of connection with other people at all. He exists purely for himself. Anarcho-capitalist libertarians are high on the psychopathy spectrum. Right-wing ideologies reflect psychopathic tendencies. As individualism becomes too extreme, it always kills sympathy and positive empathy towards others. So if you are completely disconnected from others, that's when you start to really lack sympathy and empathy, and you're just all about you, or me is what I mean. So consciousness is the byproduct of a mind that has achieved a localist, individual view of reality. If we over-identify with our conscious, we become strangers to our soul. If we over-identify with our unconscious, we become strangers to our body. and turn into body and even mind renouncers like Buddhists. So, yeah, this is very important to understand. Remember, we have the avatar, monadic, and absolute perspective. We still have the avatar perspective. We want to still, and we have the monadic perspective as well. So we want to still take care of our bodies, take care of our avatars, and we still want to respect our individuality. But we also want to realize that we are part of an interconnected whole as well. So we want to have all the different perspectives and be able to switch between them because they are all important. And it all works together. We don't want to deny one or the other. So left brain dominants are too connected with the body and not enough with the soul. And see, we can see this again with, sort of the example of atheistic materialists, scientific atheist materialists. They have extreme left brain dominance and the connection to the avatar perspective, that they have no concept whatsoever of the monadic or absolute perspectives. Right brain dominants are too disconnected from the body, but this gives them a much better chance of achieving enlightenment or certainly different states of consciousness. Enlightenment religions often push an outright anti-body agenda. However, true enlightenment means that you should not despise your body, your avatar, the physical vehicle of your soul, any more than you should despise your car, the physical vehicle for your body. You should gain absolute understanding and mastery of the physical world before you choose to leave it. Otherwise, you'll be coming straight back because you haven't outgrown it yet. So we exist in the holos in order to evolve, learn, and grow. And if you aren't using your time in the holos to self-actualize, you're just going to be caught in that cycle of incarnation over and over and over and over again. Just like if you don't pass school, well, you're going to have to redo that grade. You're going to have to redo that grade again and again and again and again until you finally pass. And the holos is where we are able to self-actualize. And again, this is the real ironic thing, in that many New Age systems and systems like Buddhism teach to detach from the world and self-negate to escape reincarnation. But the ironic thing about that is exactly what will tie you back to this world, because if you are not self-actualizing, and if instead you are self-negating, you aren't doing exactly what it is that you need to do in order to achieve that higher level of consciousness to where you can make choices about if you want to incarnate or not. So think about it like this. If the holos is sort of school, Hyperions are those who want to study and pass. Whereas those who are of New Age or Buddhism who teach self-negation, they're just kind of sitting in the corner, not studying at all, just being like, well, if we just detach, school will eventually be over and we won't have to do it anymore. But no, that's not how it works. You're just going to have to repeat the grade over again. So anyways, I just want to point that out. It's not a perfect analogy by any means. But I just want to point this out because a lot of people are not familiar with Hyperianism, and we get a lot of people who confuse us with New Age mysticism, Buddhism, Hinduism, certain things like this. And I just want to emphasize that we are completely different. We are completely different from systems like New Age mysticism and Buddhist systems. While many of those systems are about self-negation and detachment. We are about self-actualization and evolution. We aren't about negating until we dissolve. We are about actualizing until we become God. It couldn't be more opposite. It couldn't be more opposite. But since there are some similarities, like the world being an illusion and at root reality based on nothingness and things like that, since there are some commonalities, people get confused. But really, when it comes to the way in which one acts on their journey in life, it could not be more opposed. They are completely opposite. So thinking is a left brain characteristic, while feeling is a right brain characteristic. Sensing is the defining left brain characteristic, preceding thinking, while intuition is the defining right brain characteristic, preceding feeling. Therefore, our world is sort of a battleground for sensing types versus intuitives. And can't you kind of see this? You can see sort of this battle between, think of like the battle between atheists and, New Age mystics. They're completely opposed. One is extreme left brain thinking, and one is extreme right brain thinking. Well, guess what Hyperions are? We aren't one or the other. We are the third choice that hardly anyone else is aware of. The synthesis of left and right brain, integrated, guided by logic and reason. They're just two halves of the puzzle piece that need to be ordered and fit together. You're only seeing one piece of one part of the puzzle. And the reason why I kind of laugh like this is because it should be obvious. It should be obvious. But the vast majority of humanity cannot grasp these very important ideas. So sensing and intuition are about data collection, while thinking and feelings are about data evaluation. Humanity began as data collectors, and only slowly acquired the means to evaluate data. Today, most humans evaluate data emotionally. Few do rationally. So, sensing and intuition are about data collecting. Sensing, associated with the left hemispheric functions, associated with inverse Fourier transforms and space-time representations, that is the holos. Left brain, holos, sensing, space-time representation. This is about data collecting. You're collecting data from your senses, the world around you. Right brain intuition is collecting data from the unconscious. So both intuition, right brain, and left brain sensing are both about data collecting, but in two different ways. One's associated with the frequency domain and the unconscious. One's associated with the space-time domain and the holos and the senses, the sensory world. Now, what do you do? Now that you have gathered information, you have to evaluate the information. And then so you can either evaluate the information via thinking and reason, or by emotion. And the vast majority of humanity evaluates information via emotion. So again, how you can see this dichotomy, a very left brain sort of, again, think about atheists. They are collecting data through their senses and then using a form of logic and reason, a form of thinking, not true logic and reason, but a form of thinking to evaluate the information. And then if you think about, New Age and mystic types, they're using intuition to gather data, and they're using emotion to evaluate. Now, of course, there are always exceptions, and this is a sliding scale, but we use extreme examples to be able to get a grasp of this. But the idea is that Hyperianism is about the integration of all these different things together. We can collect data from our senses and from intuition, and we evaluate them using logic and reason. So we can get information connected from the source, but evaluate it using logic and reason. And I say this all the time. Check out my video, The Power and Danger of Intuition. The Power and Danger of Intuition, which talks about this. How you can collect data and be plugged into the source via your intuition, but you must always evaluate it via logic and reason to filter, organize, and structure the data. Because in intuition, you're getting non-local information. And it can be a sort of chaotic, jumbled mess. And you need thinking, reason, to organize that chaotic, jumbled mess into something rational. Anyway, I won't go into detail with that because I talked a lot about it in my other video. Check it out. So therefore, our battleground, our world is a battleground for sensing types versus intuitives. And again, we see this clearly. And we can even see this clearly in how the world developed in Western thought versus Eastern thought. Western thought is very left brain, right brain, and Eastern thought's very right brain. Western's very left brain, Eastern's very right brain. So again, even in the development of the world, West and East, we can see this left versus right brain dichotomy. And sensing versus intuition. So sensing and intuition are about data collection. Oh, I read that, sorry. So extroversion is a left brain characteristic, and introversion is a right brain characteristic. Extroversion and introversion have the effect of reversing the polarity of thinking and feeling, or sensing and intuition. In other words, although intuition is a right brain characteristic, if it's associated with extroversion rather than introversion, it points outward to the sensory world rather than inwards to the frequency world, and takes on a different nature. Extroverted intuitives are extremely good at reading body language and are superb con men. Most showbiz psychics are actually extroverted intuitives. Genuine psychics are introverted intuitives. Judging is a left brain characteristic, and perceiving a right brain characteristic. It says, note that INTJs are very cut off from their senses. And by the way, I am INTJ, and I just want to say that, yes, I can relate to that a lot. There's this story about Thales, the first philosopher, always having his head in the clouds, and he's always thinking about, the nature of reality, that he walked and fell into a well, into a hole in the ground. And I can relate to that very much. My thoughts are always somewhere else, and I'm very bad at interacting in the physical world. But hey, guess what? That's something I need to work on. That's where we talk about, the mirror self and working on your inner opposite and everything like that. So being connected to the sensory world, that's something that I, need to work on. And so, this is where the avatar perspective really really comes in. But anyway, just kind of funny. I can relate to this very much. But in Neoplatonic terms, thinking is a byproduct of intuition. It's a localist version of intuition. Intuition is parallel or networked processing, everything at once. Thinking is linear processing, one thing at a time in sequential order. So intuition is intuition, and the source and the frequency domain, it's very much all of the information at once. And thinking is linear sequential processing. This is why you need to use your thinking, your linear sequential processing, to order the data that you collect from intuition. Because it's all going to be all at once and jumbled up. So you need to use your sequential thinking to order and process the non-local information that comes all at one time. And again, this is why people who don't use their thinking and are just using intuition and emotion to evaluate things, this is why they come up with some really crazy ideas, because they're completely misinterpreting the information because they're not ordering it into something that makes sense. So Darwin's theory of evolution is practically useless since it omits the actual driver of evolution, the mathematical mind. The greatest event in evolutionary history was the introduction of brains that could perform inverse Fourier transforms. You wouldn't find that in any book on Darwinian evolution. And this is something that I want to point out here, is that Hyperion, see, there's a lot of people, misunderstand a lot of things about Hyperianism. Hyperianism is not against evolution, but it is against the materialist concept of evolution. So while, Darwinian evolution completely lacks teleology or a goal, and it's just about matter, Hyperianism inserts a teleological evolution. And so even Friedrich Nietzsche recognized that evolution isn't just about survival, but about power. And so evolution, so basically Darwinian evolution goes, well, evolution is all about survival. It's all about survival, survival, survival. And Nietzsche said it's all about power. And if we understand power as optimization, then Hyperianism agrees. So evolution is not about survival. Evolution is about optimization and is teleological, goal-oriented. The reason why it seems like that evolution is about survival is because in the early stages of evolution, survival is that's the stage that the system is at in terms of optimization. In other words, if you want to optimize, you need to be alive. If you're dead, if your avatar is dead, you can't optimize. So survival is a necessary step for optimization. This is why it seems like evolution is about survival. But it's not just about survival. It's about optimization, and it's a goal-oriented optimization. But it's a survival is a step that's necessary for optimization. So it entails survival within it, but it's not all about survival. So empiricists, and remember, so we talk about empirical materialist science. We talked about this a lot already, but in empirical materialist science, empiricists are sensing types. Rationalists are intuitives. So empiricists seek to understand reality via interpreting the information that their senses have revealed to them. And they ignore all non-sensory things, and they deny their existence. Rationalists, however, and remember Hyperions are rationalists, seek to understand reality via evaluating the information their intuition has revealed to them, which means they automatically take into account non-sensory things. So we already sort of talked about this, how empiricists collect data through their senses and then evaluate it, whereas rationalists and Hyperions collect data through their intuition and their senses too, when appropriate, when you need to navigate. But when trying to understand the ultimate nature of reality, information is collected via intuition, but then evaluated via reason. So rationalists seek to understand reality via evaluating their information their intuition has revealed to them, which means that they are exploring the non-sensory realm, the immaterial realm, the realm of the frequency domain. And I want to point this out again because, again, we place logic and reason above all else. That doesn't mean the intuition is not important. As you can see, intuition is incredibly important. But when we say that we place logic and reason above all else, it means that logic and reason is the directing function, the evaluating function. So, anyway, these are two radically different approaches to ontology and epistemology. Remember, ontology deals with what is real, what is. Ontology is the study of being. And epistemology is knowledge. So empiricism and rationalism are radically different approaches to ontology, what is real, and knowledge, what you can know. For empiricists, the only possible existence, the only possible things that can exist for empiricists, for sensing types, are things that can, in principle, be detected by the senses. That is, all dimensionless entities, such as the mind, the soul, the monad, are automatically dismissed. Because you can't physically sense a mind, a soul, a monad. All knowledge, for them, concerns sensory facts. Although, as Nietzsche pointed out, all such facts are actually just interpretations. Nietzsche himself ultimately believed in will to power, which we were just talking about, as the basis for existence, hence was no materialist, although he also opposed all classical metaphysical accounts of existence, hence was often on the side of materialist, which is really funny because Nietzsche was opposed to classical idea of metaphysics, but he wasn't a materialist, but he posited the will to power as the basis of existence, which is kind of funny because the will to power is actually a metaphysical principle, but Nietzsche, hated metaphysics, but he was actually, proposing what is ultimately a metaphysical principle. Anyway, for rationalists, anything can and does exist provided it's part of a rational, complete, and consistent epistemology, what can be knowledge. Anything that belongs to such in epistemology can't not exist. So empiricists deny this. So what do you mean by can't not exist? For example, the mind, the soul, being equal to 0 can't not exist, because nothingness can't not exist. It must exist. It has to exist. It's rationally necessary for it to exist. So here's the thing. If you indeed say that reality is rational, and Hyperions do say that reality is rational, then there are certain things that have to exist. Because the reason demands that it exist. An example of that is nothing. Nothing must exist. It can't not exist. Rationally, it has to exist. You cannot prevent nothing from existing, and nothing needs nothing external to exist. Nothingness mathematically is equivalent to zero, and internally, zero can contain all opposites. So zero, nothingness, is a container for everything. And this, explained really concisely, is a glimpse into how to rationally deduce the ground of existence, starting with nothing at all but reason. Empiricists deny this. Because remember, empiricists don't place reason first. Empiricists place empirical observation first. That's why they're empiricists. That is the definition of empiricism. And scientific materialism is an empirical ideology, not rationalist. So empiricists deny this, which means they have no interest in a rational, complete, and consistent epistemology. When given a choice between what they can empirically observe and reason, they'll side with what they can empirically observe. This is very similar how some mainstream religious people, when given a choice between, say, science and what it says in the Bible, they'll side with what it says in the Bible, because they place faith over empiricism. Empiricists place empirical observation over reason. And so you see how you have this move from faith to empiricism to rationalism. And again, this is how you can see how Hyperianism is the next evolutionary step. A lot of people are beginning to move away from faith, but they're falling into the trap of empiricism. And empiricism is just another false ideology. Just like how powerful faith was a couple hundred years ago, now empiricism is powerful today, but we must understand that it is reason that trumps empiricism. So their epistemology, their system of so-called knowledge, empiricists, has nothing to do with reason and logic. It's about observation and empiricism. This doesn't mean that they won't use reason and logic, but they use reason and logic as subservient to empiricism. They'll use a empirical twisted form of logic and reason to support their empirical data. Just like if a mainstream religious person finds empirical evidence to support what's in the Bible, they'll say, oh, look! But as soon as there's empirical evidence that is against the Bible, they'll dismiss it. Same thing with empiricism. They'll use logic and reason whenever it supports empiricism, but whenever logic and reason contradicts empiricism, they'll ignore it. Because for empiricists, empirical observation trumps reason. Rationalists, this is not the case. Hyperions are rationalists. We know that this is a rational reality. So, reason trumps sense data. Our senses can deceive us all the time. Our senses are constantly deceiving us. Hell, according to your senses, I'm sitting in front of you talking to you right now, but I'm not. I'm hundreds of miles away. That's a sort of a silly example, but it gives you an idea of what I mean. If you were born with a VR headset hardwired to your brain, to your mind, to your face, you would believe, your senses would tell you that that VR world was real. But it's not. If you could take off the headset, your senses would show you that it isn't real. Reason is what allows us to take off the VR headset of the holos. Reason is what allows us to take off the VR headset of empiricism. Empiricism is being stuck in the VR headset mentality and dismissing that there's a code. Hyperions, rationalists go, hey, yeah, guess what? There is a so-called physical reality, but there's also a code behind the scenes, the frequency domain, the domain of mind, that is responsible, a rational reality that is responsible for the illusory world of the holos. So empirical epistemology has nothing to do with reason and logic. It's all about the senses and experiments, about observable facts and their method, and not about any truly rational principles. All non-observable facts, including the vast majority of mathematical facts, are rejected. Empiricists have no interests in completeness and consistency. They support an empirical method, not a rationalist epistemology. No true epistemology, what can be known, is either experimentally verifiable or experimentally falsifiable. It's rationally and logically impregnable and infallible. A true epistemology, true knowledge, can't contain any errors. It must be eternal. It must be necessary. It can't be contingent. It can't be provisional or temporal. It can't be incomplete, inconsistent, falsifiable, and forever in need of verification as sciences. All scientists, it cannot be stressed enough, are philosophically opposed to reason and logic. And this is true. And people have a really hard time understanding this. They think that scientific materialism and empiricism is all about reason and logic. No, it's not. It's about empiricism. They use a form of logic, but only in subservience to prop up their empirical epistemology. They deny the supremacy of logic and reason. Just like even, mainstream religion will use a form of logic and reason to try and make sense of their faith. Some do, not all of them, but some do. But not when reason contradicts with what their holy book says. Ultimately, faith trumps reason. Same thing with empiricists here. So, if they weren't opposed to reason and logic, they would endorse the principle of sufficient reason and place it at the core of science. And the principle of sufficient reason is at the core of Hyperianism, which in essence says that reality is rational and everything has a rational explanation. Rational explanation doesn't mean material or mechanistic. Rational just means that there is a reason for everything. And when I say reason for everything, it doesn't mean something like like, oh, so-and-so got hit by a car, and the reason he got hit by a car was because, it actually broke his leg, and later on, if he didn't break his leg, then he would have actually ran into the store, and there was a robbery in the store, and he would have been killed. So there was a. That's not what we mean by reason, a reason for everything. What we mean is the principle of sufficient reason, which means that everything has an explanation. There is an explanation for everything. If something occurs, there's an explanation for it. For example, the Big Bang. There is a reason, an explanation for the Big Bang. In terms of Hyperianism, this is when the frequency domain, the source, went from symmetry to asymmetry, in phase to out of phase, when there was a symmetry break. That was the reason for the Big Bang, the explanation for the Big Bang. Empiricists do not accept the principle of sufficient reason. They can appeal to such things as randomness, random quantum fluctuations, emergentism, things that are non-explanations. So, if they were about logic and reason, they would endorse the principle of sufficient reason and place it at the core of science. But instead, they repudiate this principle. They endorse a principle of no sufficient reason for existence and for what happens in the universe. This is why science is all about randomness, acausation, indeterminism, indeterminacy, uncertainty, approximation, chance, accident, miracles, and magic. You hear this all the time, right? You know, such and such randomly occurred. Life was an accident. All of this stands opposed to precision, logic, reason, analysis, exactness, certainty, true conservation laws, completeness, consistency, infallibility, necessity, eternity, the absolute. You cannot be both an empirical scientist and a person who endorses reason, because empiricism and rationalism are opposite philosophical positions. Literally, they are the opposite. If you don't believe me, go Google it right now. Science is opposed to reason. That's a rational fact. Empirical science is about the delusional, unreliable, fallible human senses, and empirical scientists attempt to understand eternal existence via organs, the human senses, that evolved with no regard to the objective pursuit of truth. We have no physical sensory organ for truth. Our senses reveal things to us, but what those things are is anyone's guess or belief. Reason is our only true instrument of truth, and reason has nothing to do with the senses. Reason is purely to do with the eternal, necessary truths of mathematics. If this is a mathematical world, it's rational. If this is an empirical scientific world, it's irrational. So go ahead, choose your side. Are you a rationalist or are you an irrationalist? So this is a really important thing to understand with regard to Hyperianism, is that we reject the idea of placing sense data over reason, empiricism. We are rationalists. Now, this doesn't mean that we reject all the scientific discoveries that have been made. Empiricism has done a good job at making advancements in the physical world. So we don't deny that. What we are opposed to is that having success in the physical world does not mean that you understand anything about the nature of reality. Imagine, again, a video game world and the code. You can be great as a video game character in creating fantastic video game items, but that doesn't mean that you understand the code. You can be great at creating video game items and still deny that the code exists. Same thing here. We as Hyperians are rationalists and understand that we can know the truth, the ground, the necessary, eternal aspect of existence, which is the frequency domain, via reason. Reason coupled with intuition, is what gives us access to the frequency domain of the source, which is the true ground of existence. The sensory holos, our senses gives us access to it, but that's illusion, that's Maya. It's not the true ultimate ground of reality. It's a space-time Fourier projection of the frequency domain. And so, as we can see, we want to be well integrated and having all these different aspects working together. And bringing this all back around to what we were talking about with regard to consciousness. Consciousness is what carved out our individuality. And so now, we must return back to our connection to the source and to our intuition while retaining and continuing to develop our left brain consciousness as well. It's all about integrating and synchronizing. And this is why we are the next evolutionary step. We integrate and synchronize both the left and right hemispheric functions and viewpoints together in a unified whole. We understand the absolute, monadic, and avatar perspectives. We understand that we are not just our bodies, but we are avatars, but that we are also eternal monadic nodes that exist in the absolute network as one. And all of this guided by logic and reason. And we will go forward and create a new world, new Terra, based on this understanding, so that we can have an optimal network instead of the shitty network that we have today, that is the result of the fact that the nodes don't even realize that they're nodes, don't even realize that they're part of the, let alone realize they're part of the absolute network. And this is why we must create a new world with the ontological understanding of what existence is. And that is that existence is an absolute mind, particularized and individuated and experiencing itself. And so let's experience ourselves in a beautiful world rather than the hellish world we have now. And let's create that society of the divine.